Okay, in this video, we're going to get into object-oriented coding, and there's a lot to this, but the basic concepts really aren't that challenging. So, in object-oriented coding, we're going to create a class. Let's actually create one that makes more sense to the example. We're going to create a class. And that class is going to act as a blueprint, just as a blueprint for a house, right? If you're going to build a house, you create a blueprint. It has all the room dimensions, all the wiring, all the water, all that, right? And then you take that blueprint and you build a house. Well, there's nothing to stop you from taking that blueprint and building a million houses, right? All with that same blueprint. And object-oriented coding is similar to that concept. So we could create a class, which is going to be the blueprint, and then create as many instances of that blueprint. So if we created a house class, we could then instantiate that house class to build an actual house. And then we could instantiate it again to build another house. And we could keep doing this until we built a whole neighborhood or a whole city. So let's take a simple example. Let's say we're going to create a dog class, right? And I'm going to put a main in there just to speed up the typing. Okay, so I have this dog class, and let's treat this as the blueprint for a dog, right? And then we could create as many real dogs based off this blueprint. So let's give the dog a couple of attributes, right? So let's give it an attribute of, and I'll explain public-private in a second, right? Let's give it an attribute, let's leave that off to make it easier, of a name, right? Because dogs have names. And let's give it the dog a hair color, right? So we'll make that a string also, hair color. Right? And dogs have many more attributes, but let's just start with name and the hair color of the dog. Right? So if I wanted to create a dog, right, I would say, I would declare a variable of type dog, just like I declare an integer. If I want to declare an integer variable x, I say int x, right? If I want to declare a variable of type dog, I could say dog d1, right? And now I have a dog. But to actually create that dog, so back to our house, to actually build that house, I actually say equals new dog. And now I have a variable called d1, and it's of type dog, right? So I could do this again. I could say d2 equals new dog. I could go into a loop and create, millions of dogs, and they would all have unique names and hair colors. Now, the one thing I didn't tell when I created the new dog, I didn't tell it what the name of the dog was and what the hair color. And you can do this when you create a new instance of the dog. And the way you do that is in the class dog, right? You create constructors. And constructor is a method that has the same name as the actual class, right? So if you notice that the class name is dog, so I'm going to create a method called dog, and I'm going to accept no arguments, and I'm going to set the default name for the dog to be no name, and I'm going to set the default hair color of the dog to be no hair, right? Okay. And yes, that's kind of an odd name, but that's what my default dog is going to be created with, which is what D1 and D2 are. Now I'm also going to create a method that's not going to return anything, that's going to call, display dog information, right? And this can get called, this can get called by anybody else to display the dog information. And in here I'm going to say, you know, dog name, and I'm going to print out the dog name, and then I'm going to print out, right, the dog hair color, and I'm going to say hair color. So now anybody calling this method is going to print out the name or the name and the hair color of the dog. So for instance, let's just have one here, and if now I print out the information, I display dog information, the way I do that is I use the variable name dot display dog information, or display dog information, right? And because the variable name is D1, and now D1 has all the methods that are inside of the class dog, I can actually use them. So if I run this code now, let's think about what happens. I create a variable D1 of type dog, which calls the default constructor for dog, because that's what's happening right there. It's calling the default constructor. So the name is going to be no name, the hair color is going to be no hair. Then for dog D1, I display the dog information, and it's going to print everything out. And if I run this, right, I get no name, no hair. Now, in the previous videos, we talked about overloading methods. And one method that I can overload very easily is the constructor. So I'm going to copy and I'm going to paste this. But I'm going to now accept two strings, name, or let's just do n, and string h. So it's going to accept two arguments, right? And instead of making the name no name, I'm going to make it whatever gets passed in, and whatever the hair color got passed in, which was h right here, I'm going to assign that. So now if I create a new dog, let's display that information, right? Now I'm going to create a new dog, D2 equals new dog, but this time I'm going to pass him information, and I'm going to call my dog Fido, and I'm going to give it a hair color of brown, right? Okay. And now if I display the information for D2, display dog information, right? For D2, it should have a name of Fido and a hair color brown, right? So if I run this, right, now Fido has the second dog, right? I should, right, let's print this out, right? Sys out dog 1, right? And then let's print dog 2, right? Okay, so there's my second dog. So now when I run this, you can see that dog 1 has no name, no hair color, dog 2 has Fido and brown. And look, the class dog only has one variable for name and one variable for hair color. But since I instantiated the dog class once for D1 and another time for D2, when I instantiated it for D2, it made a whole nother copy of this method, these attributes for the second dog, and it's actually keeping them separate, right? Now, when I have a class, these variables in here at the class level by default would be accessible outside the class, but we want to keep them private to the class so that the only methods that have access to it are the ones inside this dog class, right? So external methods won't have access to it when they instantiate the dog, right? So now let's say for dog 1, I created the dog, but then later, a family, took the puppy home and wanted to give it a name, and they want to set the name. What we do inside our class is we create setters and potentially getters. So we give the external users of this dog class the ability to set, the name or set the hair color. So I'm going to accept a string n, right? And in here, I'm going to say name equals n, right? And the reason for setters and getters is to be able to set values of the attributes after it's been instantiated. So for instance, this dog was born, maybe in a kennel, and or the dog pound, and it was created, and it didn't have a name, right? It probably had hair color, but it didn't have a name. And then later on, somebody purchases or takes this dog home. So I'm just gonna say dog is taken home and given a name, right? And the way you would give it a name is you'd say d1 dot set name, and you pass it a name. Let's call the dog Rover, right? Okay. Now D1 has the name Rover, and I'm gonna make sure that that got set by displaying the dog information again, right? And this is for dog 1 after I set the name to Rover. So if I run this, first dog 1 had no name, no hair color, then the dog's taken home, and now look, when I print out the information, Rover has, or the dog has a name and still no hair color. And I could write another setter, right? Just like I wrote for set name, I could write one for public void set hair color, right? Accept a string and set it hair color equals to whatever gets passed in. So now, maybe when the dog is born, it has no hair, and then as it grows, maybe then the hair starts to come in, and it's given a name, and then we're gonna set also the hair color, set hair color, and we'll make it black hair, right? And now when I print out the information for the dog, it should have hair color. So again, the first time it's born, no name, no hair color. Then it's taken home, and now all of a sudden it's called Rover and it has black hair, right? I could have accomplished these two things when I instantiated the dog, like I did down here, right? But if you don't know it at that time, then it's going to call the default constructor and give it, whatever your default values are for that. So these are called setters because they're setting attributes of the dog, instantiated dog, from outside the class. And there's also getters, right? Maybe you don't want to display all the dog information. Maybe you just want to get the name of the dog. So I could say public string get name, right? It doesn't pass any values, and it's going to return the name, which is called name up there, right? Return name. And now maybe later on in my program, right, I might want to do something like getting the dog name for D2, right? Dot, 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 right? And then I could say D2's name is, right? And I could call D2 dot get name, right? And it's going to get the name of D2 for me, and it's printed out. So let's run this code, right? So now getting the dog name for D2, D2's name is Fido. So these are called getters and setters. And it's typical that you give access to some of your variables from the outside, but you want to keep control over it. You don't want people to say, D2.name equals, right? You want them to go through your methods. Why do you want that? Maybe you have a limit for the length of a name, and in here you could check to see if the length of the name is appropriate, right? What if somebody names their dog with 800 characters in their string? maybe you want to check to make sure their name is, 20 or 30 characters or less, okay? So these are getters and setters for your dog class. So again, the dog class is the blueprint for a dog. So name, hair color. We might even have age, right? Private, int age, right? And now the dog has an age, right? And in the default constructor, we would set the age to, maybe the age is in days or years, right? And we would set it to 0 or 1 or 2. And all the variables you can think of for the dog would be the attributes. And then anytime you want to create a new dog, you say dog D1 equals new dog, dog D2 equals new dog, dog whatever. You could have an array of dogs. You could have, as many as you want. And every time you say equals new dog, it's going to create separate instances of these attributes for each particular dog so that it keeps track of them for you. So in short, that's a general introduction to what object-oriented coding is all about. It allows you to create a blueprint for a particular type of thing. In this case, I did a dog. I could have done a person, right? And the person could have a name. I could have done an account, right? And the account would have a balance in the account, right? I could do any type of entity that I might want to create more than one of over and over and over again.